First of all, I want to welcome you all here to this important event. My name is Ken Coleman. I'm a professor of political science here at the University of Michigan. And I'm also director of the International Institute. And I want to welcome you to this event on struggles against authoritarian rule in the Middle East. We have a very distinguished panel of Michigan faculty that are experts on this region. And I'm delighted that they agreed to come today on relatively short notice. The International Institute has a lot of events like this. They're going on all the time. We have a whole series, for example, this semester on Afghanistan. And we invite you to come to all of our events that you can. We have an event, for example, on Tuesday, February 15th, inviting Rajiv Chandrasekaran, an award-winning author and senior correspondent for the Washington Post, who will give a lecture titled The Longest War, Frontline View of the U.S. Mission in Afghanistan. That will be here in the International Institute in 1636 at 4 o'clock on the 15th. That's just an example of what we do. This event here today is to have a conversation and to listen to experts and then to answer your questions and to deliberate about these important events that are happening. I have a couple of things I need to stress. One is today's event is being photographed, recorded, and also broadcast via live stream. So if you prefer not to appear on camera, we invite you to relocate to the overflow room. You'll also notice that there are cards and pens or pencils at your place. We will have a question and answer time after our speakers speak, after the last speaker. And we invite you to write down your questions on a card. And we'll have 2 opportunities to submit your questions. I will try to ask as many as possible, but of course can't accommodate all. We also want to remind you that the University of Michigan strives to create an open forum for conversation, one in which diverse opinions can be expressed and heard respectfully. So I don't need to say much about the events that have riveted us on television and on the internet. Anyone who in some future time writes the history would not end the story today. It's in the midst of this history. It's happening, and it's all at once a ripe time to have a conversation like this. But we know that it's possible that the most dramatic events are ahead of us. Today we have 6 distinguished speakers who know a lot about the internal region, the internal politics of the region, internal societies, and also about the international context. So we will go in the following order. I will introduce each speaker one at a time, but I will list the order that we'll go in right now. We'll have Juan Cole, then Susan Waltz, Mark Tesler, Nadine Naber, Philip Potter, and Joshua Cole. So our first speaker is Juan Cole. He's the Richard P. Mitchell Collegiate Professor of History. And I want you to give a warm welcome to Juan.
Thank you very much, Ken, and thank you all for coming out. You know, Hosni Mubarak, the president of Egypt, is an Air Force Marshal, and he's been there since 1981. And if anyone knows anything serious about Egypt, you know that the Egyptians are distinguished by their sense of humor. They are the ones that generate the jokes in the Middle East. So one of the jokes they tell about Hosni Mubarak and have told for years is that, you know, he is getting on in age. He's 82. He's been there forever. So some of his advisors are said to have come to him behind the scenes. And they said to him, "Mr. President, don't you think it's time for you to say goodbye to the Egyptian people?" And they say that Mubarak's face gets this look of utter astonishment on it, just complete surprise. And he says, "Why? Where are they going?" And you'll note that the joke has been borne out in reality because if there was an opportunity for him to say goodbye, it was last Friday, and he didn't take it. Mubarak represents a complex regime in Egypt, a complex and large bureaucracy. The regime originates in a military coup in 1952. And it really has only had 4 leaders since 1952. General Mohammed Naguib, who quickly was replaced by Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser. Abdel Nasser had a long run. He ruled until his death in 1970. Abdel Nasser increasingly favored socialist policies, and he created a very large socialist bureaucracy. John Waterbury estimated that at its height, the Egyptian public sector was actually larger than some of those in Eastern Europe. So it was a country whose economy was very much in government hands. To be fair, it had some successes because Egypt had not industrialized. It was a largely agrarian society. It was locked into growing cotton, which after the revolution in synthetics had become less and less valuable. And then there are problems with, just growing one crop like that. Monocultures are bad for the soil, and so there were problems in productivity, problems in salinization of the soil. So being a large cotton farm was Egypt's fate for the late 19th and most of the early 20th century. Abdel Nasser industrialized the place. He started factories, and he succeeded in doubling the average per capita income of Egyptians between 1960 and 1970 because of this government-led industrialization drive. But as we all know, history is somewhat dialectical, and when you build a lot of buildings, you need contractors. You need the Donald Trump types who will build the buildings. The government didn't actually socialize that part of things. And so Abdel Nasser, through the 60s and then it continued afterwards, created a huge class of new millionaires who were building contractors and other kinds of government contractors. Because as we all know, when you have a big government sector, and our own Pentagon and some other government agencies are a good example of this, there's a tendency then to subcontract a lot of the work, which then creates private wealth. And by the 70s, the private wealth had become substantial, and the military ruler at the time, Anwar Sadat, who succeeded Abdel Nasser, moved to the right. He moved away from socialism to more right-wing policies. That meant getting rid of the Soviet Union, allying with the United States, opening up the Egyptian economy, beginning a process of privatization. And so Anwar Sadat's moves in this regard, and making a peace treaty with Israel, because the Egyptian economy couldn't flourish as long as there were these constant wars and uncertainty. So for the new business class, Egypt was moved into a position of alliance with the United States, a relative alliance with Israel, and its tourist sector boomed. 11 million tourists came last year. Its business investment is way up. The city of Cairo is sprouting all of these hotels and other enterprises. There's a lot of money floating around. New suburbs of Cairo or sections of Cairo are being built, which locally they call the Beverly Hills sections. So there's an enormous amount of wealth around. I was in Cairo in May, and I wanted to do some bourgeois tourism. So I went to the new mall, City Mall at Medina Nasser. It's 5 city blocks, and I got lost. You know how you're walking in a mall, you see a store, you're kind of interested in it, you think, well, I'm not that interested in it, maybe I'll stop in on my way back. I never could find it again. I thought I might go to a movie, but I couldn't find the cinema. I don't know if any Egyptians are able to buy things in that mall. There seemed to be a lot of Gulf Arabs from the oil states visiting, and the Egyptians, I think, were doing a lot of window shopping. So the country, as it's moved into this mode of a kind of alliance of the military regime with the new business class has created enormous inequalities. It's created new opportunities. But what I would argue is that the political system stagnated, became sclerotic. It was Mubarak's son Gamal, it was the cronies of Mubarak and his son Gamal, it was a handful of influential high military officers who made the important decisions about the economy. There was growth for the first time in a long time in the zeros. There was 5, 6, 7% growth, and it created a revolution of rising expectations. When you've got, rising expectations and you've got a blocked middle class that can't make its way in, then you get a lot of trouble. The other thing that happened was that as textiles began taking off and you had investment in the industrial sector, the working class became more important. And it is very badly paid and is very badly treated. Egypt is still, in some ways, has a lot of feudal attitudes. I had a colleague, Samar Shahata, who did field work on the floor of an Egyptian factory. And, the workers can't talk to the managers face-to-face, eye-to-eye. They have to demonstrate a kind of body language of subservience. So the idea of factory workers striking, demanding their rights, the Egyptian elite would swat that down. 2 years ago it happened. The April 6th movement, which was an alliance of the working class, the textile workers, and the new middle class, promoted these strikes in Egypt, and the government crushed them. The Muslim Brotherhood, the main Muslim fundamentalist organization, declined to join in that movement. They're right of cinder. They're right wing. They don't support anything but private property. They had objected to Abdel Nasser's land reform. So that movement was split. It was the new middle class and the workers who joined, and the youth who joined to make for it. And the April 6th movement of 2 years ago was the kernel of the current uprising. It was the April 6th movement of factory workers and the new middle class youth, Google and GM in American terms, that made for this uprising. And of course, lots of other people joined in. Over time, the ruling party through which the military and the business elite run Egypt, which is a kind of one-party state, the National Democratic Party, which is three lies. The National Democratic Party had some small rivals, and the elections in Egypt were kind of like the elections in old-time Chicago. The machine always won, the dead could vote, and the only question is how badly you'd be defeated if you ran against it. But there were some small parties that got into parliament. There's a leftist party, Tagamo. There's a new movement of the zeros, Kifaya, enough, which was enough of Mubarak. And that split, and you had Ayman Noor and the Tomorrow Party came out of it. And Ayman Noor ran against Mubarak in 2005. He got about 7 or 8% of the vote, was allowed to get that much. So those new parties or old left parties also have been very important to organizing the youth. But for the most part, this is a spontaneous uprising of networked youth. And in Arabic, in Egypt, they're calling it Thawrat al-Shabab, the youth revolution. And the median age in Egypt is 24. Back in the late 60s, when my generation was making a lot of trouble, the median age of the United States was 25. It's now over 30. So obviously, the large bulge of youth is important to this. What do they want? They want an opening. They want an end to one-party rule. They want free communications. They want an end to the Facebook police. They want economic opportunity, and the working class shouldn't be forgotten in this. The factory workers want to be better paid, better respected. This is a largely left-wing revolution. And because it's a left-wing revolution, US corporate media cannot understand it. They keep looking, is there any ethnicity here? Could there possibly be like the equivalent of, you know, some ethnic group that's marginalized, or maybe they're Muslim fundamentalists, maybe that's what's going on. The only narratives the corporate media allows for an event like this are ethnic or religious. They don't want to talk about the working class and class, because of course we managed to get rid of the American working class. Nobody says they are, and only 9% of workers here are unionized. But that's what's going on in Egypt. It's a revolution from the left. And whether it will succeed or not is still very much up in the air. And the military and the business classes, the people with the billions at the top who have benefited so much from this system, are not going to go quietly. They tried cracking down hard on Wednesday and Thursday. That didn't work, A, and B, it produced a very bad international reaction. There's some evidence that they now are going to gradually, behind the scenes, move in tanks, prevent further demonstrations, round up people at night. So they're going to try to pull an Iran. And that's the big question, is can they tamp this thing down over time, or will it have staying power? Egypt is losing $300 million a year in its economy. Every day there are these demonstrations and strikes. If the demonstrators can keep this going, sooner or later, even the business class is going to go to Omar Suleiman, the new vice president, and say, Mubarak's not worth it. And that's the big question, is will that happen? Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Susan Waltz, professor of public policy at the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy.
Yes, you can.
All right.
Okay, we're ready to go. Likewise, I thank you for coming out today, and I think it's really wonderful to see this crowd and this kind of interest in this part of the world and all of the exciting events that are taking place. Juan spoke about Egypt. I have spent the last 30 years visiting and studying, following the smaller country of Tunisia, where it all started, and I'd like to believe that you'd all turn out. Just if we were going to be talking about Tunisia today. But I think that what has happened in Tunisia has had obviously a lot of significance for the rest of for the region, and we'll probably want to put the Tunisian experience in a comparative context. People are calling the Tunisian experience the Jasmine Revolution, and are talking about it as an opening in the Middle East, and are speaking of Ben Ali, the erstwhile president of Tunisia, as a dictator, as an oppressive ruler. And I want to take, in my short presentation, the long view of the Tunisian experience, and remind people, if they had known it, and inform you if you hadn't, that when Ben Ali came into power in 1987, he engaged in a bloodless coup. Many people said that it was bloodless because the former president, Habib Bourguiba, had no blood left in him. He was notorious for basically leading parades and having people have to hold his hands up because he was so frail and so incompetent at the end. And the countryside, a huge sigh of relief when the former Minister of Interior and defense official, Ben Ali, moved in the bloodless coup and removed Habib Bourguiba. Ben Ali was awarded a Human Rights Prize in his first year of rule. The UN decided to set up the Arab world's human rights organization in Tunisia because of the new opening that took place there. Ben Ali, in his first years of rule, abolished the constitutional provision for president for life, which was subsequently more or less reinstated. He abolished security courts, emptied the prisons. It was the period of fleurissement, of a flowering in Tunisia. And many people were understandably very, very optimistic about the future of Tunisia at that point. And so when we look at what's going on in Tunisia today, I think it's important to keep that historical perspective. And we have to also ask what changed that the world, what the world once saw as a very open leader and as a hopeful opportunity for democracy to really install itself in the Arab world. What happened to reverse that course? And I think if we look at Tunisia's history, the 200 or so years of independence in that region, you can identify two big threads or strands in the political culture. One that as a political scientist, I call rationalism, but that we may want to associate with more accessible terms like reform or pluralism or liberalism. And then on the other side, a strand of personalism or cult of the personality. And Tunisia has vacillated over time between these two. Both threads can be traced in parallel form through the country's history. When the first president after independence, Habib Bourguiba, ran the country for close to more than 30 years, he ultimately developed a cult of personality, and that was what people thought was overthrown when Ben Ali came into power. And Ben Ali, those of us who looked at him in his early years, the common analysis for Ben Ali was that he had no social backing. He had really no class, no particular segment of society that would really back him, and that he needed to bring in the human rights activists. He brought several of them into his cabinet. He needed to liberalize in order to build a power base. And that lasted for some short period of time, but then very quickly, he moved to actually begin to develop these personalistic bases of power. What did they look like? They really took two forms. They were the incursion of family and associates into the various structures of society, so that the Ben Ali and the Trabelsi families over time profited from the Washington Consensus-inspired economic reforms, so that many of the state enterprises that were privatized came into the control directly or indirectly of the Ben Ali family and his wife's family, a hairdresser. His wife was a hairdresser and left the country a billionaire, basically, and did that essentially by family members basically brokering many of the deals that came in from financing from the Emirates and other parts of the Saudi peninsula. So that was one of the threads. The other thread was through a cultivation of fear of radical Islam, fear of Algeria, and basically bringing in some of the people who in other circumstances would have been more inclined to oppose him. He neutralized his opposition, and that really kept the country going for some 30 years. I think what most Tunisians who would identify themselves as a sort of a middle-class, well-educated, felt that over the last 20, 25 years, or last 20 years after the first 3 years of the Ben Ali regime, the one word that rises to the top of their political experiences, that they felt infantilized, that they felt like that their intelligence was basically, they were followed when they dared step out of line, and they felt like that their possibilities of engaging in intelligent discourse about their country's affairs were extremely limited. The papers were written in what they called the language of wood, a wooden language. Basically, Ben Ali cut the ribbon on this. Ben Ali traveled to this part of the country, and that was all that you could read in the news on a daily basis. And it appears that the budget numbers that the parliament looked at were pretty much rigged. The whole country was really cut off. The political classes were cut off from any kind of a discourse. So where does that leave us today? Despite all of this kind of a gloomy look at the past, I'm cautiously optimistic, because what we have in Tunisia right now is the rationalist reform phase that is rising. The government that is the custodial government that has been put in place until elections take place is largely supplied by technocrats who are very well educated and very capable. And they face a number of challenges, to be clear. And let me just sort of list what those challenges are, and then quickly say why I think that there's still a chance of success for this Jasmine revolution. The big challenges, the two main challenges I would say that they face is, first of all, dismantling the old power structure, which includes the party, the police, and a goon squad that is equivalent to the Tonton Macoute, if you remember them from Haiti, of something like 150,000 informally employed state security officers who have been basically been kept off the streets by following people around and beating them up or otherwise harassing them for the last several years. They are still out there in the streets and have not yet been fully brought under control, and the RCD party itself is going to be dismantled, but it has had a monopoly on the power structures, and so that's one of the big challenges. The other one is the economy. The unemployment rate among the working class has been actually fairly low at about 5%, but the unemployment rate among university-educated people has been around 35 to 50% in various parts of the country, and that's clearly a huge challenge. And add to that about 8% of the country's receipts come from tourism, and that many of the larger tour operators from Europe have suspended operations. It's going to be a very, very big challenge for Tunisia to recover. So those are the two big challenges that they face. But the good news is that the elite in the country are staying, and moreover, many of the elite who have been in Europe are returning. And I don't mean by elite those who were associated with Ben Ali, but those who had actually taken harbor elsewhere during the last several years because they found no place for themselves. So there is the press is opening up. And I think Tunisia will also offer us an opportunity to see how a more moderate version or variety of Islamism can take part in the political, in the whole political panoply, and that the Islamists will show that they have a place and a role to play, and maybe Tunisia will assert itself as what I think it can be, the Costa Rica of the Middle East. Stop here and thanks.
Somebody has to put it on. Okay, that's not the right one. Oh, okay. The one on.
Okay, our next speaker is Mark Tesler. Mark is the Samuel J. Eldersfeld Collegiate Professor of Political Science. He's the Vice Provost for International Affairs.
Well, I add my thanks to Ken and the Institute for organizing this. Not surprisingly, I've been thinking a lot in the last few weeks about the year I spent in Egypt and the several years that I lived in Tunisia and studied there. And we've been asked to keep our remarks short, so I don't think I have time to properly tell the joke about Mubarak that I heard when I was in Egypt. But if you know the postage stamp joke, maybe that will ring a bell, and if I have some time at the end, maybe I will tell it, or maybe someone will ask it. It's actually much harsher than Juan's, and I think fits where it is today. I was also thinking about Tunisia. I was living in Tunisia during the 1984 riots, which maybe today seem a little bit pale in comparison, but in fact were national riots that shook the regime and set in motion, not directly, but somewhat, at least somewhat indirectly, the events that led to Bourguiba being phased out and Ben Ali coming in. And also, if I had time, I'd love to tell some stories about what it was like to be there at the time. There were massive protests, and what comes through is something that both speakers really touched on, that it's about injustice and it's about hopelessness. The country has resources. Some of the problems aren't going to go away overnight. I mean, you heard about the youth bulge that Juan mentioned. It exists in Tunisia as well. And there is going to be unemployment. But people are really angry about the fundamental unfairness, that there is resources. You can see people lining up in front of the Sheraton Hotel for $100,000 weddings, and then people are being paid a few dinars a day to stand guard. It's about the lack, it's about the hopelessness, the lack of redress, and the fundamental unfairness of it. I think if people felt that, yes, we have problems, but the burdens are being shared equitably, and yes, we can't do everything overnight, but the resources we have are being invested so that things will be better for our kids, there'd be a lot more patience. That's not the perception that people have. And if you've been there during those periods or even talked to people subsequently, there are a lot of really interesting and touching stories about the way that expresses itself. I'd be happy to come back to either of those, but what I really want to do is talk about something different for the few minutes I have. And that's about how people are thinking about, how people in the Arab world, in the Arab Middle East, are thinking about Islam in the context of all this. There's an awful lot of misinformation, maybe sometimes based on ignorance, maybe sometimes based on deliberate misconception, I really don't know. But some of the things you hear about the Muslim Brotherhood and Islamists and Muslim Brotherhood, Al-Qaeda, is that the same? Is it different? There's an awful lot of Islamophobia in this country, and it really colors, at least in part, the way we look at events. Well, I've been doing research on this, and this is not the place for a research report, but I want to use the few minutes I have to give you some findings from the public opinion research I've been doing. I'm working with a group of Arab scholars. There are 2 of us in the US, and all the rest of the partners are from different Middle Eastern Arab countries. We're doing surveys in a number of countries. We're currently in 10 countries. We've got data from 8 so far. We've been trying repeatedly to do it in Egypt, and we have not been able to get permission, but we think now we'll be able to do it. And we haven't done it in Tunisia, but we're now in conversations about doing it in Tunisia. But we do have large, nationally representative, probability-based samples in 8 countries, 2 in the Gulf, Algeria, Morocco in the Maghreb, Yemen, Palestine, Lebanon, Jordan. So we've got a very good representation. These are very good samples, and I think it's fair to say, especially since they're implemented and designed in collaboration with people from the region, that the findings we have offer some meaningful food for thought. And I would offer the 3 or 4 following conclusions, trying to generalize from this rather large and ongoing project. First of all, the population is about split. It varies a little bit from country to country and a little bit over time, but about 50-50 in those who want Islam to play. First of all, actually, I should say the first finding is that there's overwhelming support, 85 or 90% across all the surveys. We've done about 14 so far for democracy. Nobody is talking about nobody's talking about going back to the Nasser system, and nobody is talking about some sort of an Iranian theology. It's democracy they want. About half the population, pretty much everywhere, it depends a little bit on which question you ask, but the finding that comes through very clearly, the population is pretty evenly divided between those who want democracy, and it should be secular democracy. Islam is fine, it's important, it's our religion, it's important to us, but leave it out of politics. It's bad for politics, it's bad for the religion, it's my private faith. And about the other half wants Islam to play a role in political affairs. Not in some sort of a theocratic context, I'm trying to make that clear, but that they do think that in some meaningful way, Islam should play a role. And there are different ways in which people express that. So that's the second finding, support for democracy, but a division on whether Islam is a part of that political formula. The third is if you compare these 2 groups, those who want secular democracy and those who want democracy with Islam, they are virtually identical on a whole range of other attitudes and values. Those who want Islam as part of their democratic formula, are somewhat more conservative on some issues, particularly relating to women, although not universally, and the difference isn't that big, but you can see a difference. They do have a somewhat more conservative social agenda. But on political questions, on treatment of minorities, on issues of economic justice, on the importance of democracy, on a whole wide range of things, on social relations, social capital, for those who know what these terms mean, there isn't any difference. So those who support Islam come out of the mainstream. They're not off with a distinctive mindset or a particularly different, distinctive, maybe even narrow, more conservative point of view. They're simply people that think Islam should play an important role. And it's not necessarily all that different than certain tendencies in the U.S. about how people who feel our public policies should be informed by certain kinds of Christian values, or certain factions in Israel that think we're a Jewish state, so that has to mean something. But again, it's a very mainstream movement. And the point I'm trying to make is that some of the notions you hear, I guess they're extreme, and maybe nobody in this audience takes them seriously, but we're going to have Sharia law in the U.S. tomorrow, and we're going to have the caliphate the day after. Everything we know about how people in these countries are thinking about their own religion bears no relationship to those kinds of stereotypes that were offered. And the final point I would make in terms of what's coming out of this research is that if you ask, well, what are some of the circumstances that lead people to be in the group that want Islam with democracy, democracy with Islam, as opposed to secular democracy, one of the things that, there are a number of things, but one of the things that predisposes people toward that point of view, to be on that half of the normative divide on this question, is whether they feel the government is doing a good job or not. And those who are more negative in their judgments about the government are more likely to believe that Islam should play a political role. Maybe not surprising, because the governments about which they have these negative attitudes, that I would like to tell my joke about if I had time, are secular, nationalist, authoritarian regimes. And if we divide the countries up into those that are somewhat free, have a certain limited but nonetheless reasonable openness for political rights, there's freedom of the press and things like that, and those that are more restrictive, the relationship that I just mentioned becomes stronger in the more restrictive countries. The degree to which negative attitudes toward the government is likely to predispose an individual to be on the democracy with Islam as opposed to the secular democracy side of the equation, that relationship increases, or the importance of attitude towards the government in predicting which category you're in increases if the government itself is more authoritarian. Well, I can see I've used up my time, so maybe you won't hear the joke, or maybe we'll hear it later. Thanks.
Our next speaker is Nadine Naber. She's an assistant professor of American culture and women's studies here at the University of Michigan.
Thank you. Thank you to the International Institute for organizing this important event. I have personal and academic connections. Can you hear me? Yes, okay. With what's going on the ground in Egypt. I'm going to begin with a YouTube clip for you from Asma Mahfouz. She is a 26-year-old woman whose January 18th vlog is said to have helped mobilize the million that turned up in Cairo and the thousands of others on January 25th in other cities. Actually, let me make it bigger for you. I'm going to just show very brief sections. She's mobilizing people through the internet to show up on January 25th. Sorry. It's okay because they're reading it.
sorry about this.
Should I start it over? Okay, be really quick.
أنا بس بصور لكم فيديو عشان أقول لكم رسالة واحدة. عايزين ننزل يوم 25. لو لسه عندنا كرامة ولسه عايزين نعيش كإنسان وكبني آدمين في البلد دي لازم ننزل يوم 25. هننزل نطالب بحقنا، بحقنا كبني آدمين. مش هقول لكم حقنا كسياسيين ولا عايزين ولا مجلس الشعب ولا رئيس ولا أي زفت من الكلام ده كله. عايزين حقنا، مش عايزين أي حاجة تانية. الحكومة دي كلها بقت بايظة، رئيس فاسد والدنيا بايظة وأمن دولة بايظ. الناس دي ما خافوش من الموت وخافوا من أمن الدولة. خافوا نزل 5 و10 ونزل بيهم لميدان التحرير أو ميدان اللازوغلي أو في أي حتة عشوائية حتى ويتكلم الناس ويقول لهم بقى كفاية بدل ما نولع في نفسنا تعالوا نتكلم ونسجل موقف. ده هيفرق وهيفرق كتير قوي. اوعى تقول مفيش أمل. طول ما أنت بتقول مفيش أمل هيبقى مفيش أمل. طول ما ليه؟ مش علشان ان انت تبقى كويس وقاعد في حالك وماشي جنب الحيط، الحيطه هتقع عليك وهتقع علينا كلنا. انزل وطالب بحقك وبحقي وبحق اهلك وبحقنا كلنا. انا نازله يوم 25 وهقول للفساد لا والنظام لا.
Oh, you couldn't read it? She's basically saying, I'm going down on January 25th. Tell everyone you know, don't be afraid. Even if they kill us, I'm going down to demand my rights and an end to corruption. Come with me. If you don't come, you'll be, all this stuff. So how do I get out of this to the internet back? Escape, okay. PC users, okay. Okay. So I'm going to have some slides going in the background, so hopefully you can listen to me while you watch. Esma's vlog and the stories of many Egyptian women offer up a challenge to two key questions framing U.S. discourse on the January 25th revolution. The two questions that we hear in the U.S., where are the women? And, but what if Islamic extremists take over? Scholar Paul Ahmad argues that the revolution began as a protest led by labor unions, many women-based labor unions in manufacturing cities. The women now holding down Tahrir Square as we speak are of all ages and social groups, and their struggle cannot be explained through Orientalist tropes that reduce Arab women to passive victims of culture or religion. They are active participants in a grassroots struggle against poverty and state corruption, rigged elections, repression, torture, and police brutality. They are leading marches, attending the wounded, and participating in identity checks of state-supported thugs. They have helped create human shields to protect Egyptian Antiquities Museum, the Arab League headquarters, and one another. They have helped organize neighborhood watch groups and committees to protect private and public property nationwide. They are fighting dictatorship among millions of people, not guided by any one sect or political party, and united under one slogan: we want an end to this regime. Master Mims, protest rapper in the UK, best represents my point in the lyrics to her song, Back Down Mubarak, where she states, first give me a job, then let's talk about my hijab. And for anyone wondering about the oppression of Arab women, these women have indeed suffered. Nuha Juan was attacked, beaten half to death by Mubarak thugs, who ripped her shirt open and has stitches in her head. Several women and men are now martyrs, over 200. Amira, killed by a police officer. Liz, hit by a police car. Sally Zahran, hit by a Mubarak thug in the back of the head with a bat, went home to sleep and never woke up, just last week. All of these stories. Since the demonstrations pushed the police out of the center of Cairo, several women have made statements like this. It's the first time I have never been harassed in Cairo. Egyptian police are notorious for sexual harassment and violence against women. Some Egyptian women are on the front lines of the war over ideas, fighting the Egyptian state TV and exposing the contradictions between US discourse on democracy and US practice. as the Egyptian regime pays thugs to run over peaceful demonstrators, stab them, and kill them, many women are challenging Obama and Clinton's advice that both sides need to refrain from violence. And many are outraged over the US's unanswered loyalty to Mubarak, as well as Obama's apparent backing of Vice President Omar Suleiman. Aida Saif al-Dawla, a woman of Tahrir Square and leading human rights activist with Nadim Center for Torture Survivors, is angry that Western leaders and media call Suleiman a distinguished and respected man. She has spent years seeking to expose his key role as the coordinator of the CIA's Extraordinary Rendition Program, an extrajudicial procedure in which suspected terrorists are transferred illegally to a country such as Egypt that is known to use torture during interrogation. In one case of a Pakistani man, Habib, the CIA sent him to Egypt, to Suleiman. Habib was then repeatedly zapped with high-voltage electricity, immersed in water to his nostrils, beaten, his fingers broken, and he was hung from metal hooks. After Suleiman's men extracted Habib's confession, he was transferred back to US custody, where he eventually was imprisoned at Guantanamo. As Egyptian America media pundit Muna Tahawi puts it, US stability comes at the expense of freedom and dignity of the people of my or any country. Of course, a democratic Egypt would benefit women. The government recently passed a law restricting the work of civil society organizations, many relating to the needs of women. Widespread human rights violations, including intense forms of harassment and violence against women, which many organizations in Egypt have well documented. Of course, we have learned from history that women are often pushed back to the sidelines after the revolution is over. So rather than asking, where are the women, we might ask, why has the US media focused on images of men? And in the period to come, how might the voices of the women of Tahrir remain center stage? What are the possibilities for a democratization of rights in Egypt, all civic rights in which women's participation, the rights of women, family law, and the right to organize, protest, and express freedom of speech remain central? What are the possibilities for international solidarity with Egyptian women amidst the war of ideas, and for recognizing Arab women and men as rightful agents of their own discourses and destinies? And how can we begin to conceptualize the call from Asma Mahfouz beyond dominant US discourses, as well as what you've seen, what I've been sharing with you about the mobilization of Egyptian women today? How can we begin to conceptualize the mobilization of Egyptian women or stand in solidarity? Thank you.
Okay, if you already have some questions that you've written on cards, you can pass them this way, so to your left, and we'll start picking them up, and then you can keep a card if you think you'll still have additional questions, given the comments of our remaining speakers. So our next speaker is Phil Potter. He's an assistant professor at the Gerald R. School of Public Policy. Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy. I forgot that.
We're on a first-name basis with President Ford. So I am not an expert in the politics of the region. So what I wanted to do is take a slightly different perspective on this and talk a little bit about the role that media has played in this situation, talk a little bit about US coverage, and the implications for foreign policy moving forward. So I think there are sort of three key trends that are worth keeping an eye on as we move forward, both as we look at what's going on in the Middle East and sort of the broader context for autocracies in general. It's been sort of widely noted that a lot of the reason that this has turned from perhaps just a local issue in Tunisia into a broader regional issue are changes in the media, right? And I think a lot of people have taken a very sort of simplistic view of this and said, well, the internet changes everything. People can get information, they can communicate. But at this point, the internet isn't new, right? The internet's been around for a while. People have been on the internet in these regions, and things didn't necessarily spark at that particular moment. What I think has really changed is the mixture between information, communication, and sort of entertainment on the internet, right? So it turns out that censoring hard news on the internet is a relatively trivial task, right? It's not that difficult to control the flow of hard information. And a lot of the reason it's not that hard to do is not that many people at a mass level are looking for that type of information. It's not a mass phenomenon to go read dissident blogs or to try to get translated New York Times stories. What is a mass phenomenon is things like Facebook, right? And it's this mix between the media that people use for entertainment, the media that people use for communication, and information and politicization that's really sort of changed the ballgame, I think. Authoritarian regimes can't just sort of crack down and turn these technologies off preemptively, right? It's not really a feasible thing to do because people want these things, right? And they want them at a mass level, right? And it turns out, experience is showing us that turning them off once trouble arises is sort of too little too late, right? We've seen Iran try this and largely fail. We've seen Egypt try this and largely fail. Once people are on the streets, it's too late. We had revolutions before the internet and Facebook, and we'll have them afterwards. So I think this is a real challenge for authoritarian regimes, and it's one that certainly countries like China are taking careful note of. The second thing that I think is a trend worth paying attention to in this regard is the fact that the international media, right, international news networks, have really become kind of active participants in this conflict in a way that we haven't really seen before, right? So we've seen, Anderson Cooper sort of get out there in the square and whine a lot about getting smacked around a little bit. That's, small in comparison to, the role that Al Jazeera has played here as sort of almost an active party to this conflict, right? This has been sort of Al Jazeera's sort of international coming out party in a lot of ways. The third thing that I think we should take note of is the nature of US coverage of this conflict, right? We've seen sustained sort of wall-to-wall coverage of this on the news networks for a remarkably long time for something that doesn't sort of involve the active engagement of US forces or US casualties or things of that sort. And I think that sort of matters, right? CNN, who's sort of been at the lead on this, has gotten a massive sort of ratings bump, and we all know that CNN ratings are sort of a Jon Stewart punchline. So the fact that they're able to sort of lead the way on this is surprising and sort of impressive, that the American people have been so engaged with this particular story. The reason for this is fairly clear, right? The imagery is arresting. It makes for just very dramatic coverage. You don't get a better sort of image of kind of the old versus the new than young tech-savvy protesters fighting off people on camelback, right? So the imagery is sort of amazing, but the upshot is that this is arguably the first sort of sustained, positive, differentiated coverage of the Arab world that we've gotten in the mainstream media in the US since 9/11, right? And those sorts of things make a big difference. It allows the American electorate to sort of have a more nuanced view, to differentiate groups, to understand that these countries are not indeed monolithic. And that in turn sort of puts pressure on US foreign policy. I think this is also, as a result of that, sort of one of the first opportunities for careful discussion of the role that Islam and Islamists play in these societies, right? I thought the coverage of Mubarak's interview was particularly interesting. I think having him try to play that fear card on us really sort of changed the nature of the discussion a little bit. So I think the result, we're starting to see little pieces of it coming out already. This puts pressure on the administration, right? This is not something that's happening outside of the public's view. The public is watching the administration's reaction to this. As a result, I think the Obama administration has had very little choice but to orient towards the Egyptian people as opposed to their leadership, right? So in his, at least rhetorically, so in his first sort of big public speech on this, he went on for about 5 minutes, and in those 5 minutes, he uttered the phrase, the Egyptian people 8 times, right? So this is clear, that was the punchline. That was the media soundbite that was supposed to come out of this, was that we're on the side of the Egyptian people. So in sum, I think there are some important shifts going on underway, both in sort of the broader way that media is interacting with popular movements, and in this particular case, with the coverage that it's receiving inside the United States. Thank you.
Okay, our sixth and final speaker is Joshua Cole. He's an associate professor of history here at the University of Michigan.
Hi, I am the lesser of the 2 Coles in the history department. No relation. Thank you again to Ken for organizing this very important event. I'm very pleased to see so many people, as the rest of the panelists are. I am also not a specialist in the Middle East. I'm a French historian by training, but I have some interest in French Algeria, and that's focused my work on North Africa in recent years. So I want to start maybe by expanding a little bit on some of the comments that Philip made about the way that we have been getting these stories in the media, and then talk a little bit about North Africa in the time that remains. I'll try and be as quick as possible. I'm sure you have some questions. It seems to me that there's really 2 kinds of stories that we're getting in the media about these protest movements in the Middle East. On the one hand, there are the kind of country-by-country stories, and I think stories is the important word here, about the origins of these most recent popular protest movements. And in each case, both in the print and I think in the television media, there is this look and focus for a spark, as if this explains the moment, explains the timing. So we have the story of the fruit seller who immolated himself in Tunisia. We have the story that's been circulating in recent weeks about, I believe his name is Khalid Said in Egypt, the young man who was beaten so badly by the security police. And I want to point out that in the best of these stories come from reporters, foreign reporters who are actually on the ground, somebody like Nicholas Kristof, who's been on Tahrir Square. But I also want to show that the stories that come that focus so clearly on recent sparks, and that as if there is a kind of self-evident moral content to the protest movement related to that specific moment, actually obscures the much longer prehistory that allowed these sparks to take off. And that's precisely what we are not getting from the media, and we're not getting it from Nicholas Kristof, although that's perhaps not his fault. He's very busy on the square. That is, there is a long story about the relationship between corruption and authoritarian regimes. Why is it that authoritarian regimes become corrupt? I mean, there are real histories here that the media is ill-prepared or unwilling to explore. And then, on the other hand, the second kind of story actually is a big picture story, but it is also a big picture story that seems to be equally devoid of political content. Recently, in the New York Times, I saw this recently in a Thomas Friedman article, Charles Blow had a piece in the New York Times over the weekend. There's a big story that's being told about changes in the global economy, in which in particular, the development of China, the growth of a kind of consumer economy in China has put enormous price pressures on global food markets, and that this has placed regimes all over the world that have a kind of authoritarian regimes with problematic relationships with their own population, regimes that in many cases depend on imported food sources, that they're exposed to a kind of crisis. And this crisis emerges because of these shifts in the global economy. Now here we have also the kind of absence of an analysis of the different local political circumstances in each regime that might explain why some of these protest movements happen, why they're successful in some places, and why they don't happen in others. So maybe just should give you an example. I think comparing Tunisia and Algeria in recent weeks will show that we need something in between these local stories with the kind of self-evident moral content about sparks and these big pictures. And it has to be something about long-term structures. It has to be something about the politics of these places over the last decades. Now, what's interesting about the comparison between Algeria and Tunisia is that prior to December of 2010, Tunisia was famously quiet, whereas Algeria had been having riots in many cities almost on a weekly basis for years. And yet, the popular protest movement that began in December of 2010 in Tunisia brought the regime to its knees in a matter of weeks, whereas the rioting that took off in Algeria at the same time, which spread to many Algerian cities over the last couple of months, they went nowhere. The riots went nowhere, and the regime in Algeria has emerged unscathed from these protest movements. And I was looking for sort of explanations of this, and I've been convinced by some of the reporting that I've seen from Algeria that explains it largely as the difference between the two nations largely in terms of the participation of groups from civil society in the popular movement. That is, the movement of protest in Tunisia very quickly absorbed actors from a wide spectrum of Tunisian society, including trade unions, both socialist and communist trade unions, opposition parties, political dissidents of all kinds who emerge. Some of these are groups that have been around for a long time, that have been illegal, that emerge and are quite quickly participating in this larger protest movement. In Algeria, this has not been the case. The January 2011 riots were very similar to previous patterns of rioting. They focused on local authorities. It was young men tending to attack police stations, post offices, and even members of the small parliamentary opposition in Algeria denied that these riots had any political content. They just said they're part of this old iteration, old patterns of local unrest over food prices. They actually mentioned food prices, as if that means it's not political. Now, and this is, in fact, in spite of the fact that Algeria has a much more open society than Tunisia. It has a relatively free press. Every once in a while, a journalist goes to prison, but it's not uniformly censored. There are legal trade unions, but these civil society actors simply don't get involved. The riots remain very local in their effects. Now, and one commentator that I've read has gone so far as to suggest that local unrest in Algeria has almost become ritualized in certain areas as a way for certain neglected areas to get the attention of the state. That is, people will organize a riot if they feel that if a construction project in their neighborhood is not getting the attention that they want, they organize a demonstration. The riot is followed by a few days of brief attention in the national press. A commitment of resources comes from the government, and there's a subsequent period of calm. So there's a kind of way in which in Algeria, certain kinds of expression of unrest have become part of a dialogue between the population and the state. So I'll leave it to others. I'm sure Susan Waltz and others can explain better than me why the actors from civil society became so involved so quickly in Tunisia and why Ben Ali's regime collapsed so quickly. But I do want to suggest, I think here, and following up on some of the comments that others have had, that if we want to see a viable democratic movement emerging in these places in the Middle East, we are going to have to accept that all of these actors should be present, and that includes the trade unions, it includes the Islamist organizations, of various tendencies and various commitments to be viable at all terms. That if they're not present, then we will simply have more of the same. I can ask some more questions about Algeria if you have questions, but I'll stop there in the hopes that you'll have time.
Okay, I put the questions in piles. They're sort of different categories of questions. So when I ask a question, it's representative of several that have been asked. So I'll start with this one, and the panelists, there's microphones right on your table. You just speak from there, okay? No, you don't have to touch it. You just speak right there. And feel free to volunteer the panelists, talk amongst yourselves, as they say. How would Egyptians define, quote unquote, success of this revolution? How does an Egyptian or Tunisian vision of success contrast with American or Western ideas of success?
Everybody's looking for me. Well, that's really interesting. I have to say, it reminds me, this is a very personal sort of thing, but it reminds me once when I was asked to participate in a simulation in the White House that was the National Security Council simulation. I was asked to play both the Islamist movement and the Tunisian people at the same time. I didn't. I declined. I declined the whole thing. Can you hear back there?
Not well. I think we have to.
Can you hear now? Is this better? So I can't speak for the Egyptians at all, and I'm not sure that I could even try to imagine myself into the Tunisian population. But I think that some of the other comments, I think really from Mark's survey, and some of the other comments about the hope for a fair shake, the hope for equal access into employment opportunities and other sorts of maybe more economic than political, but even also political discourse, I think would be one measure of success. Though I'm aware as I speak that my own point of reference in Tunisian society are people who are university educated, maybe high school teachers or university professors or professionals of one sort or another. And it's not clear to me that I could articulate what someone from the village of Kef that participated in setting the police station on fire last weekend. I'm not really sure that I know what for them would mean success. What I fear is that success may mean jobs for all, and that those aren't going to be forthcoming, and that there's going to be great displeasure and then a rallying on the personalistic side, perhaps after this Tunisian general that has gotten so popular. So I'll stop there, but say simply, for many Tunisians, it's a more of a liberal model that isn't that different from what France has or the U.S. has. But for many others, it may be a far more simplistic one that will actually flip the Jasmine Revolution over to the other direction.
Yeah, I think I would just echo that. There isn't necessarily just one point of view, but I think the common element is a government that they feel really cares about them and is accountable in some sense, that there is some mechanism for holding that government accountable, and that they have a government that really is accountable, that really cares. And I think the 2 points that I made based on when I was in Tunisia during their riots is this notion of justice, that if there are burdens, they're going to be shared. If there are opportunities, everybody's going to have equal access, and decisions will be based on merit and what's good for the country. These are the kinds of stories that people were telling all the time about the corruption, and that what resources available are not being squandered for jets and imported luxury cars and the benefit of a small consumer class, but they're being invested in the country. And there'll be ups and downs, and there'll always be some inequality, and corruption will always be to some extent everywhere. But that the main thrust is what we have is being invested for the benefit of all over the long term. I believe things will be better for my kids, and I believe that others are sharing the burden that I'm sharing, so I'm willing to be patient. I think that organized around the notion of justice, it often expresses itself with the term dignity, but I don't think that should be taken as some sort of a psychological factor that people are psychologically problematic and we've got to kind of raise their self-esteem. It's not that kind of dignity. It is that, but it's more fundamental. The country is really working on behalf of its people, and that's the notion of justice that I think is central to all of this.
With regard to both Egypt and Tunisia, I think one of the things we have to keep in mind is it's an oppositional movement, so it's against something. And very large numbers of people are involved in it from all kinds of social classes whose vision of the good society, as Susan said, would be quite diverse. But there are things that they agree upon, which is why these movements have occurred. One of the things they agree upon is that both Tunisia and Egypt came to have over time, growing out of that period of experimentation with state socialism of the 1960s, an increasingly authoritarian and corrupt elite at the top, which could be characterized as a mafia state. And it was a crony state. It was nepotistic. In Tunisia, the nepotism was taken to the point that the US cable traffic released by WikiLeaks suggests in 2008 that 50% of the economic elite of Tunisia was related by blood or marriage to Ben Ali, to the dictator.
Or his wife.
Blood or marriage. So the Trabulsi clan of his wife, of course, were notorious. And while the character of the elite in Egypt is not quite so narrow, there's still a lot of cronyism, a lot of nepotism, and Mubarak was grooming his son, Gamal, to be a successor. So my professor, Nadine Naber, got himself in trouble and actually was thrown in jail for 3 years, largely because he pointed this out. He said that the Arab republics of the post-colonial period have innovated. They've created a new form of government unknown to Aristotle, which, you know, Aristotle distinguished the monarchy and the aristocracy and the democracy or the republic. And he said that in Syria, Hafez al-Assad had groomed his son Bashar to succeed him. The same things were going on in Yemen and in Egypt, that the Arabs had invented monarpublicanism, dynastic republicanism. And one of the things that people are protesting against in Egypt, and certainly this comes into Tunisia in some ways as well, is a dynastic principle in republicanism, which is corrupt and nepotistic and cronyist in its character. So in that regard, both movements have already to some extent succeeded, since that was one of the big objections, was the mafia state. And the remaining elites are trying to take advantage of the fact that that has succeeded. There won't be monarpublicanism in Egypt, to then divide the public and say, well, okay, you've succeeded in what you want. But of course, there are a very large number of people who want more than simply the removal of the mafia state. They want an opening, they want equal opportunity, they want more social equality and so forth.
So there were quite a few questions about the following, but I'll just give you one representative. What effect on the Gaza and Israeli situation will be caused, or by what will the effect on that by the current Egyptian unrest?
Susan has the answer to this question. Well, I think it's probably easiest to say that an awful lot remains to be determined. For what it's worth, the Muslim Brotherhood has recently issued a statement saying that they would support the continuation of the peace treaty with Israel because it's in Egypt's interest. It's really hard to predict, to be serious about it. An awful lot depends on who comes to power. A lot depends on what the U.S. does, whether we end up playing a more constructive role than we have up till now. A lot has to do with what Israel does, whether this provides a sufficient incentive for Israel to engage in the peace process in a way that it hasn't before. Anytime you start to talk about these things, you get all different points of view. I don't think today is the time for us to be arguing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the Palestinians should have done this, and Israel should have done that, and we would probably get to that point pretty quickly. But I think the best guess is that probably we'll have more continuity than change, at least in the short term. That would be my best guess, even though, as I say, it depends on an awful lot, and we really don't know. I think it's unlikely. I'm just trying to be responsive. I don't really feel that I know the answer, but I don't think we'll see any dramatic changes in Egyptian policy in the short term. A real important question will be what happens on the border with Gaza and whether it's more open. But what happens in Gaza depends on a lot of things, partly on Palestinian politics, certainly on the Israeli siege, and whether there are other opportunities for goods and services that are needed in Egypt to come in Gaza to come in. So I know I'm not being very responsive, but I think that's where I am in thinking about it.
Could I just add that, as Mark said, it depends a lot on what happens. At the moment in Egypt, Hosni Mubarak hadn't had a vice president because he didn't want to designate a successor, and he was grooming his son Gamal. But his response to this movement has been to appoint a vice president, who is Omar Suleiman, the former head of military intelligence. Military intelligence in Egypt deals with foreign countries, so he's the one who's been trying to track down al-Qaeda and kill them. He's been involved in, as Nadine said, in rendition and torture of suspects, al-Qaeda suspects taken to Egypt by the CIA. And he has been the point man in negotiating with the Israelis and the Palestinians in the so-called peace process. He has been behind a lot of the Egyptian cooperation with the Israeli blockade of the civilian population of Gaza, which is illegal in international law. So at the moment, the person who's responsible for the status quo in Egypt has become more powerful as a result of the regime's reaction to these protests. Now, if the protest movement can be dampened and tamped down over time, and Omar Suleiman manages, as Mubarak clearly intends, to become the ruler of Egypt down the road, then that would argue for status quo. If the protest movement continues to be vigorous and that eventuality is forestalled by the people, and you get a political opening, and someone like Amr Moussa, who's the Secretary General of the Arab League, runs for president and wins, which is entirely plausible as a scenario, then the Egyptian cooperation with the blockade of the civilian population of Gaza is over with. So we're in early days to know how this is going to affect the situation, if at all.
Okay, there are a number of questions, and I'll kind of combine two here. This is mostly for Juan, but for the panel as a whole. Could you speak more on the role of the U.S. and its backing of Mubarak and now Suleiman? And I'll combine it with this question. We've often been told that this revolution is leaderless, that no obvious leaders are representing the revolutionaries or those opposing the regime. And I don't know if those questions are related. I think they are. Do you want to respond to this?
Well, the United States began backing the military regime in Egypt in a big way because of the Camp David peace accords in 1978-79. And as a result of those accords, the U.S. Congress rewarded Egypt and Israel for making peace with one another because their wars were a huge headache for the United States by giving Israel about $3 billion a year in direct aid and all kinds of other perquisites, and Egypt about $2 billion a year in direct aid, half of it military and half of it civilian. Now that has fallen to, I think, about $1.3 billion last year. But it's an enormous amount of money over the past 30 years. And that money has been important to the regime's stability, its ability to keep its military relatively strong in the absence of wars. And of course, it involves officer training. It involves other kinds of training on the U.S. part, and training for counterterrorism, which inevitably is useful in repressing ordinary people as well. So the U.S. Has backed this regime with money, with training, with political support, in part because it has become a pillar of the post-Camp David settlement in the Middle East, that Egypt is one of only two Arab countries with a formal peace treaty with Israel, although many other Arab countries have some kind of informal relationship. And Tunisia had until the late 90s for a while. Qatar, for instance, is a place that and Morocco are places that the Israelis, behind the scenes at least, have a fair amount to do. But Egypt is important to the U.S. for that reason. The Suez Canal is a major artery of world trade. 7.5% of all the trade in the world goes through the Suez Canal. About 10% of the world's petroleum, and of course it's a higher percentage of seaborne trade. So petroleum supplies are tight, and were the canal to be closed and the ships have to go around the Cape of Good Hope again, this would have an impact on world petroleum futures markets. I mean, to the extent that it could even push some countries back into recession. So the U.S. has many reasons for which it has backed this regime. It has been relatively uninterested in rocking the boat or in democratization. It has had some contacts with opposition figures, and there was a brief moment in 2005 when the Bush administration was pushing Hosni Mubarak to open up the system because of their emphasis on democratization, although it was a very selectively enforced theory of democratization, not applied to Musharraf in Pakistan. And Condi Rice went to Cairo in 2005 and criticized Hosni Mubarak for not allowing people to run against him. He was having referendums on his presidency, which, of course, you can't lose a referendum. You can do worse or better, but there's no opponent. So he responded by letting Ayman Noor, the head of the Tomorrow Party, out of prison and letting him run against him and letting him get 7 or 8% of the vote, after which he put Ayman Noor back in prison. And that was the extent of the Bush administration's ability to influence Egypt. He, moreover, let the Muslim Brotherhood in the parliamentary elections of 2006 win about 88 seats out of then 454. And this was a message to Washington that that's what comes if you bother us too much, is you get the Muslim Brotherhood. And after 2006, we never heard anything more from the Bush administration about democratization in Egypt.
I think this relates to the question that we all avoided, that was actually the second half of the first question about what would be success for the U.S. We all said we can't speak for the Egyptians and Tunisians, but we did our best, and we're unwilling to speak for ourselves. I think this is a question that the U.S. administration is struggling with and hasn't decided. Is the status quo as it has been, and to the extent that it could be resurrected in some modest form, some somewhat changed form, but more or less the same, the one that Juan just described, is really what is in our interest, and that outcome would be successful. That's not my personal view. I think the relationship we have and the standing we have and the appreciation we have by ordinary men and women in these countries is in our interest. And I think the administration is struggling to see if it can work its way toward agreeing with that proposition and what the implications of it would be. But the counter argument is you might have said the present situation is unstable. You could have said that 30 years ago, because a lot of the conditions that gave rise to the uprising now, maybe in some cases weren't quite as intense, but basically were present, as I described, with the demonstrations in the 80s. And that was in Algeria, and that was in Jordan. It was also in Egypt at the time. So that status quo, that that we don't like, and where Egyptian friends would say to me, when you go back to the U.S., give my love to the American people and tell the president to go to hell. I heard that more than once. First time I thought, well, it's just, but I've heard it a number of times from different places. So I think there is a real question about whether our longer term interests are with the people of these countries, and we want to put ourselves on that side, or whether that's hopelessly naive and it's really mixing up what our real interests are. I think I made clear what my own view is, but that's an issue that the U.S. is struggling with, and I think we'll have trouble resolving in a way that will be totally satisfactory.
Could I slip in something here? The question was really about Egypt, but I think Tunisia serves as a really interesting contrast case. And Tunisia obviously does not occupy nearly as much space in U.S. foreign policy and U.S. interests, and that's why it forms a contrast case. You don't have the Israel-Palestine issue looming in the background. You don't have a large military concern there, and so the number of people who are tracking Tunisia is much smaller. And I think that it's fair to say that the U.S. actually played a passively positive role in Tunisia over quite a period of time. There's both a glass half full and a glass half empty side to that. The WikiLeaks accounts of opulence by the ruling family, both sides, his and hers, I think really once that, as it was circulated on Facebook and other social media, that really helped provide evidence that people suspected was there all along, and the frankness with which American diplomats reported what was going on behind the scenes, I think, was actually really appreciated. And though WikiLeaks was a fairly new phenomenon, and the accounts were only from the last 2 or 3 years, there are anecdotes that go back 15, 20 years of Americans sort of telling the truth. That's the half full side. The half empty side was that they didn't really do anything about it, and they tolerated a regime that they knew was increasingly autocratic and depended upon it for cooperation in the so-called war against terror. And that takes us back to another theme that has been running through the panel, and that is the U.S. obsession with Islamism that it sees in monolithic terms, and all of the incredible missed opportunities for appreciating nuances in that movement. And Tunisia had arguably the most moderate form of it, the form that was most compatible with a Western-style democracy, and rather than tipping, using American influence to help integrate Islam into a pluralistic political system, we went the other direction. And so I think that's the huge challenge. And it's a challenge not just to the government, but to our people, to think about Islamism in forms that are other than jihadist, forms of al-Qaeda, et cetera.
Okay, I'll do one more question, and it has to do with media coverage, American media coverage. And this question asks for basically an evaluation of how the U.S. media has covered this event. And are we seeing, what are the consequences of the massive cuts in journalistic organizations in the U.S. and the effect this is having on the coverage?
You certainly saw, I should pick this up. You certainly saw that we had to play catch up early on, right? I mean, there have been cuts. We don't have the foreign correspondents, but we got there relatively quickly. To me, the question is always sort of, when you're assessing the quality of media coverage, it's a question of sort of versus what. I think we often have this idea that there is this perfect truth that the media could be uncovering and transmitting to the people, and that would somehow be very informative and change U.S. policy in a positive way. But it turns out when you talk to people, what that truth is variable, right? That isn't a constant thing that we could know. So to me, there's an interaction here between the media coverage and the audience, right? And I think what's been interesting about this has been the sustained attention that the American people have been willing to pay to this. As long as people will tune in, CNN will cover this into 2015 if people will watch. So, you know, that's what to me is the surprising part of it, is that you have this sustained attention to relatively hard news. We've all seen this unfold with Iraq and with various other things. As there is sustained attention, they bring out everyone who's an expert on the matter, and then they run out of everyone who's an expert, and they bring on everybody else. So you get depth as long as you have attention, and I think that's what we've seen here.
Can I add to that? Yeah, I think we have more information about this than we can deal with already. One of the things that struck me, though, is the way in which the mainstream corporate media is, in fact, not very inventive on its ability to use new kinds of social media to get contact with people in other places. Let me just tell you a story. A colleague of mine in the history department has a son who's a graduate student at UCLA in Los Angeles, who had some experience in Cairo. He lived in Cairo, involved in various development projects. And at the beginnings of the protest movement, he was calling people on the phone to find out what was going on, find out how the protest movement was being organized. And with their permission, he put the contents of those cell phone conversations online. He started a Twitter account. And pretty soon he had so many hits that he crashed the server he was using. He got some friends to some friends, I guess, through the university to give him some larger server space. Meanwhile, he got more telephone numbers from more people in Cairo. And by the end of the week, he had a team from Al Jazeera and from Fox News show up at his apartment in Los Angeles to try and figure out how he was generating so much traffic. And so this is an example of how somebody, I mean, he's just working apparently with a borrowed Mac with a cracked screen that he got from his brother, and he has managed to create all of this information coming from the people in the square. It seems to me that the mainstream media could take a lesson from that.
Yeah, could I just add that the corporate media in the United States blew off Tunisia, did not cover it at all. And that, I mean, Ben Wiedemann actually managed to get to Tunis with a camera crew. And I never saw him report. Maybe he did once or twice. It means the producers back in Atlanta were declining his reports because they thought that some starlet being supposedly rehabilitated was going to bring in more money. And I think, you know, I'm just outraged that the bottom line for our media coverage of important events, and if you didn't cover Tunisia, how would you have any idea about Egypt? The bottom line for important events has now become how much advertising revenue the news will make. I can remember a time at which the national media considered news to be a lost leader. They didn't expect it to make a lot of money. They had bureaus in places like Cairo, and the idea that you can just parachute these guys in and they can cover these stories without having been there is crazy. And the idea that we should depend on corporate media for our news when the question for them is, will it sell more tampons, is just a non-starter. And we are being very badly served by this situation.
Okay. The final thing we're going to do is Mark Tesler's going to tell his joke, because I got 3 requests for Mark Tesler's joke.
Okay.
But before doing that, I do want to thank the School of Social Work very much for accommodating our request to the space and assisting with our technological needs. I want to thank you all for coming. Mark will have the final word.
All right, so this is a joke that I was told by Egyptians, and it's a harsh joke, and I'm going to try to tell it in a shortened version. As Juan was saying, the Egyptians have great humor. We should tell our stories about Sadat and about Nasser. Sometimes in my Middle East course, I tell the joke about each one to give a sense of how the different regimes look to Egyptians. So this is going to be a shortened version, which will maybe lose some of the impact. Mubarak, you know, was always interested in having his ego puffed up by his ministers. And his ministers knew this, of course. So one of them came in and said, Mr. President, we've got a wonderful project to show the Egyptian people how many wonderful things you are doing for them. We're going to have a brand new postage stamp, and your picture is going to be prominently on the front, only your picture on the front. And Mubarak says, well, That doesn't sound like such a big deal. He says, well, no, but the deal is that we are going to make it here. You know, we used to have to go to Sicily for the dyes and the special glue that was needed. We would have to go to France for that. And so this is going to be entirely produced in Egypt, and it will be a symbol of our technological ability and our entry. This was when I was living there in the 80s, so maybe postage stamp isn't a big deal today. But this will be of our ability to be self-sufficient, independent, and developing and prosperous. And what will the Egyptians know this means? Your picture will be on the front. So every few days, Mubarak is asking the minister, you know, when am I going to see this stamp? We're waiting. It's a great idea. When are we going to see the stamp? And finally, after several weeks of this, Mubarak says, I want that stamp. I'm not going to wait any longer. And the minister says, well, actually, we've had the stamp for a while. There's a bit of a problem with it. It seems it doesn't stick. He says, well, what are people going to think, that we can't even produce glue that sticks? Mr. President, it's not the glue. We can't get people to spit on the back of it.
All right, on that note, thank you for coming. Thanks to our panelists very much.
We'll never get research permits.